The last lecture talked about Valentinian, Valens, and the barbarian threat that the empire faced in the 370s. And when we concluded, we talked about the failure of the Eastern Emperor Valens to deal effectively with the groups of Goths that had crossed into Roman territory in the mid 370s, and ultimately Valens's unwise decision to engage them in battle on August 9th of 378. This, of course, resulted in the death of Valens and a signal change in the way that the empire would work from this point forward. Because the Goths that entered the empire under Valens, rebelled, and killed the emperor, were never pushed back out of the empire. They were never punished, and they were never destroyed for what they had done. And this is completely new in Roman history. Now, to understand the bigger context, we have to shift our focus back temporarily to the west and pick up a strand that we left hanging. So when the Emperor Valentinian died, uh, there were a number of knockoff effects that occur because of this. Valentinian had been doing dynastic planning in the years before his death in 375, and even starting in 367, Valentinian had named his son Gratian as his co-emperor. Gratian at that point was a child. But what Valentinian was doing was following in the footsteps of emperors from the 2nd and 3rd century, appointing a successor so that when he died it would be clear who would follow him. But as often happens in that kind of context, the emperor died before his son was really ready to effectively take power. And so when Valentinian died, Gratian was still a teenager. But Gratian had been trained by Valentinian and had been brought up by Valentinian to compensate for some of the weaknesses that Valentinian felt in his own position. And part of this was the idea, of course, that Gratian would live long enough that he would become a mature adult while Valentinian was still alive. But this isn't what happened. You can see, though, the planning that Valentinian undertook to create this kind of balanced regime. And part of this compensates for one of the greatest handicaps that Valentinian was thought to have. Now, most of our sources that describe Valentinian are senatorial sources. They're elite sources. They're written by people like Ammianus, who are catering to a particular cultural perspective, a perspective that is very similar to the ideals that we talked about when we talked about the Second Sophistic. And one of the great handicaps that Valentinian has in that environment is that he was a military figure. He was not a senator. He was not a member of the cultivated elite brought up in these systems of education. Now, this isn't completely fair to Valentinian. Valentinian, for example, we know, knew Virgil well enough that he could engage in literary games with the poet Ausonius. But he didn't have this reputation. Instead, Valentinian had this reputation as somebody who is relatively uneducated and uncontrollable, and therefore prone to anger in a way that people who are supposed to be educated and cultivated are not supposed to be prone to. And so what we see, for example, is the discussion that Ammianus has of Valentinian is always tinted by this idea that Valentinian had great intentions and actually was, for the most part, a very effective and capable person, but this anger that he couldn't control was his undoing. And Ammianus makes this completely clear when he talks about the death of Valentinian, because he says that the death of Valentinian is something that grows out of his inability to control his anger. So Ammianus says this occurred during a negotiation with the Quadi, a Germanic tribe. And when the Quadi are doing this negotiation, they say something that provokes Valentinian. They say that their countrymen have been angered by the wrongful and untimely attempt by Valentinian to build a fort. And this, Ammianus says, brings on a paroxysm of anger in Valentinian, who began his answer to them boiling with fury, and in noisy and abusive language he accused the whole Quadi people of ingratitude and forgetfulness of the past favors that Valentinian and Rome had done for them. He gradually grew calmer when, as if struck by lightning, his breathing and his speech were obstructed by a fiery flush that obscured his face. And so what Ammianus is talking about is a stroke, apparently, that Valentinian had when he was negotiating with the Quadi, and he was angry because of this. But if you think back to the discussion of the Second Sophistic, it's expected that somebody who is a member of the elite can control his anger and doesn't have this kind of boiling over and improper use of language that Valentinian does. And so this sort of senatorial characterization of Valentinian meant that when he was dealing with the Senate, the sort of civic elite of the city of Rome, and the people administering the Western Empire, there was always this kind of disconnect and this suspicion of Valentinian as somebody who was different. And this is why, in part, Valentinian trained Gratian to be the counterpoint to this. Valentinian had very strong relations with the army. He was very well respected by the army and by his generals. He did not have as strong relations with the Senate, but he was very much aware of the need for Gratian to have those strong relationships. And so Gratian was given a thorough rhetorical and philosophical education by the poet and orator Ausonius. And the idea behind this was that this would make Gratian a member, a full-fledged, fully identifiable member of the cultural elite that governed the empire. He would have, in essence, the bona fides that he could, were he a normal person, enter into those elite interactions in the same way that, say, the colleagues of Libanius would. And this is very deliberate by Valentinian. It's a very deliberate idea of crafting a set of skills that Gratian could draw upon so that he could run the empire in a way that complemented the sort of abilities that Valentinian had. And ultimately, when Valentinian would die, Gratian would have a stronger footing on which to both administer the empire and defend it. But of course, Gratian never got to that point. Gratian takes power as senior emperor following the death of, well, takes power as emperor in the West following the death of Valentinian, and then following the death of Valens, he takes power as senior emperor. He is still basically just a young child. He's basically college age at the time of Valens' death. And this is a bit of a problem because Gratian, in a sense, had not yet established the true the true ecumenical power and authority that an emperor required. And we see this immediately. Because after Valentinian's death, troops in Pannonia, the home region of Valentinian and Valens, had proclaimed Gratian's 4-year-old brother, Valentinian II, co-emperor following the death of Valentinian. And Valentinian II, at this point, was a cipher. He was a young child. He had no capacity to run the empire at all. And Gratian actually manages this in a very reasonable way. What Gratian does is he recognizes Valentinian II as co-emperor, but he doesn't give him any territories. He doesn't give him any governing responsibilities. He just acknowledges that he has the standing or the status of a co-emperor. And then he left Valentinian II with his mother and with a Frankish bodyguard named Maroboduus. And they watched over him without him really having to do much of anything. Now this happens in 375, and Valens is still around, so this doesn't matter particularly. But after Valens is killed in 378, Gratian is faced with a real challenge. You see on this coin, you see the portrait of Gratian, of course, on the left, but on the right you see a representation that is really quite interesting. This is a coin that says Reparatio Rei Publica, and you see a picture of the emperor rising up or lifting up a representation of the Republic, and he is carrying a victory, an icon of victory in his other hand. Now, this is important because what Gratian is speaking to at this moment is a restoration of the state. And when Valens dies, Gratian has to figure out how to do this. There are barbarians ranging unchecked through the Eastern Empire, and Gratian has the responsibility to figure out how to solve this problem. And he understood very well that Valentinian II, who is still under 10 years old, doesn't have the capacity to deal with this. And so while there are two emperors, and under normal circumstances, Gratian would, potentially shift Valentinian II over to the east and then have an imperial regime run by two brothers with regional portfolios in the same way that Valentinian and Valens had done this in the 360s and early 370s. Gratian cannot do that because there's a real problem he has to respond to. There's a real issue. The republic needs to be restored and he needs to do it. And so instead of turning affairs in the East over to a child, what Gratian does is he promotes a general, a Spanish general named Theodosius. Now, Theodosius was the son of another general, also named Theodosius, who had served under Valens and had actually served very well under Valens and participated in putting down a revolt against Valens. But the father of the future emperor had fallen afoul of Valens and had been executed on a trumped up charge of treason. And so Theodosius is no great friend of Gratian's family. But Gratian had also learned to pivot from the policies and even the advisors of his father and his uncle. Not long after taking power from Valentinian I, Gratian had a number of the associates of Theodosius, or of Valentinian I, who had really troubled people in the Senate. He had them deposed and in some cases executed. And so Gratian really did believe that he was breaking with the past. And so the appointment of Theodosius was something that was at that point somewhat possible and reasonable, because what it would allow, what Gratian would be able to do is advertise that even the wrong done in the past had been restored, and the families that had been singled out by the previous imperial regime and punished by the previous imperial regime could be restored. And so there are a number of reasons why he would turn to Theodosius as the new emperor of the East. One is the symbolic aspect of a kind of restoration of people who felt like they had been done wrong. And given Gratian's perspective and his training as a person who was supposed to interact well with the senatorial elite, this made a lot of sense. But there was another reason too, of course. Theodosius was an accomplished military figure, and he was somebody who could step into the problems that the East faced, and, at least in theory, deal with those problems. And so Theodosius was appointed Emperor of the East in 379, a few months after the death of Valens. And Theodosius immediately set to work trying to deal with the major problems in the eastern part of the empire, and in particular, dealing with the problems of the Goths. And the first stage in this was to repair and replace the troops who had been killed in Adrianople. So Theodosius undertook a massive recruitment drive, beating the bushes across the countryside in Asia Minor to try to find people who could join the Roman army and be trained up so that they could fight against the Goths. And we have texts that are written by people in the early 380s, late 370s, early 380s, that talk about the great enthusiasm that they have for Theodosius's ability to build an army completely anew, using people like farmers and cobblers and regular civilians. And Theodosius does fill the army, and he does train these people up. But once they take the field against the Goths, it's clear that this is not a Roman army of the quality of the Eastern army that was destroyed at Adrianople. These people do not have the training. All of this sort of human capital that the old Eastern Roman army had acquired through years and years of service together, training together, and trusting each other, this is gone. And when this new Roman force takes the field against the Goths, they are pretty soundly defeated. And Theodosius has to retreat back to Constantinople, and eventually Theodosius is forced to come to an agreement with the Goths. And this is the issue that we started with. When the Goths come to this agreement with Theodosius, Theodosius is in a much weaker position. And this is because Theodosius had been chosen to come to power and had claimed he came to power with the express primary goal of punishing the Goths, defeating the Goths, avenging the death of the emperor. And he doesn't do this. Instead, he has to make a peace treaty that, in many Romans' eyes, looks like surrender. Now, Theodosius faces a number of problems because of this, because he doesn't deliver on the promise that had been the whole reason why he was selected to be emperor. And so Theodosius has to take a number of steps to try to respond and create a new narrative for what kind of an emperor he is. And so part of what he does is he turns over a lot of the administrative positions in the Eastern Empire to people who came with him from Spain. And there are a number of advantages to this. These are people that he trusted. These are also people without a power base in the Eastern Empire. And so they don't have competing loyalties. They are loyal to Theodosius because they are, in a sense, a cabal that's running the empire themselves. So this makes a lot of sense for an emperor who is exposed to the degree that Theodosius is. But there are disadvantages too. These Easterners that are serving with or serving alongside these Spaniards have different experiences and different understandings of what's going on. And this is particularly important because Theodosius faces a religious challenge in the East that's unlike anything that people in the West really appreciated. The Emperor Constantius and the Emperor Valens had both been inclined towards the support of Arianism. And Theodosius, as a Western Christian who grew up speaking Latin, didn't particularly, and wasn't an Arian, didn't particularly find himself very sympathetic to these concerns, and a lot of the administrators that he brought over from the West also were not sympathetic to this. And so this created a religious dynamic in the East that was, in a sense, an imposition of a Western perspective on the Christological concerns of the moment that was at some odds with what the previous almost 45 years had been like in the East. The other thing that Theodosius does as a way to kind of compensate for the loss of the claim to military superiority that had originally been the reason he was supposed to be in charge, Theodosius pivots and he becomes not just a military leader, but somebody who is championing a religious agenda. Part of this agenda is a Catholic Christian effort to remove Arian Christians from positions of prominence in the East. But another part of this, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is a push towards the Christianization of the Roman state, and a Christianization based not on gentle persuasion and encouragement of conversion, but instead the active suppression of paganism. And this pivot works. Theodosius manages, despite his failures against the Goths, to position himself and put himself in a very strong position of authority in the East. Part of this is the advisors he chooses, but part of this is also the way that he pivots and redefines his reign from one that's initially supposed to be one based on military success to one that's now going to be based on a religious agenda that involves promoting a certain type of Christianity and discouraging adherence to both paganism and other types of Christianity. And so this makes Theodosius's position much stronger in the 380s, but also much different. And what we see is once Theodosius is able to stabilize his positioning in the East in this way, he actually becomes a strong and effective emperor. And by the mid-380s, he became the real power in the government, the central figure around whom all of imperial decision-making would revolve. And part of this grows out of problems that persisted from the very early stages of Gratian's regime. Now, we talked about how when Gratian replaces his father Theodosius as emperor, part of what he does is depose a number of the most prominent advisors that Valentinian had put in place. And this eventually comes back to haunt him, because in 383, Gratian is overthrown by a general named Magnus Maximus, who is controlling Roman forces in Britain. Gratian is then arrested and executed in Gaul, and Magnus Maximus is pushing basically a grievance about the military, or about the marginalization of military officials under Gratian. Now, Theodosius, at this point, doesn't quite know how to respond. He doesn't really, in 383, have the capacity to march against Magnus Maximus. And so what he decides to do is effectively recognize Magnus Maximus's control of Britain and Gaul, but He also falls in line with a counter move led by senators in Rome and the bishop Ambrose of Milan to try to keep Italy out of the hands of Magnus Maximus. And this counter move involves taking Valentinian II, who is still a child, but officially still an emperor, though an emperor without territories or portfolio. And this alliance of the Bishop of Milan, Ambrose, and the senators in Rome elevate Valentinian II to an emperor with an actual territory. They make him emperor of Italy, and they use the forces, the military forces in Italy, to block the Alpine passes so Magnus Maximus cannot get into Italy. Now, eventually, in the late 380s, Theodosius is able to mount an offensive, attack Magnus Maximus, and in 387 he defeats Magnus Maximus and restores the whole of the West to the control of Valentinian II. Now, Valentinian II at this moment is 16 years old, so this is still not a mature emperor, but Theodosius has made himself the true power behind the throne and the actual protector of Valentinian II. And so this marks a pretty significant change in the way that Theodosius represents his own power. So the Missorium of Theodosius, you see in the center, it's a silver disc. It's preserved from the city of Merida in Spain, and you see the way that Theodosius is represented, an emperor with very stylized features and his eyes upturned. Now these upturned eyes are in essence a representation of his piety. You also see around his head a circle. This is called a nimbus, and this indicates a sort of divine and Christian piety. And the upturned eyes show Theodosius's attention to the divine. You look then at the portraiture of his son. This is the Emperor Arcadius. And you see a similar stylized portraiture, again with the upturned eyes and this very sort of stylized way of representing his face. Now, what's interesting is at the same time, the dynasty starts issuing portraits of Valentinian II. Because what has happened is that Theodosius has now blended the dynasty of Valentinian with the dynasty of Theodosius. And the protectorate that Theodosius is exercising over Valentinian II comes out of the blending of the dynasty of Valentinian and the dynasty of Theodosius. And that blending is something that's done artistically. It's very much deliberate that Arcadius and Valentinian II and Theodosius are all going to have this same way of being represented. They are, in a way, almost as indistinguishable as the tetrarchs of the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. But here the image is this same stylized face with the upturned eyes, and this becomes a way to emphasize the connections across this dynasty. Now, what's also important is this image of Valentinian II. This image, which is also this image actually comes from the East. And so this isn't a portrait of Valentinian II that's put up in territory that Valentinian II is governing. This suggests then that what you have here is a universal representation of the unity of the dynasty of Valentinian and the dynasty of Theodosius. And Theodosius took seriously this idea that he was now the key joining East and West, and also the key joining the dynasty of Valentinian to the dynasty that he himself had created. Now, the message resonated for a time, but it didn't resonate forever. And part of this has to do with events in the West. In 392, there's another revolt in the West, this time against Valentinian II. And now, following the defeat of Maximus in 388, Theodosius put a Frankish official named Arbogast in as the regent of Valentinian II. But by 392, Valentinian II had finally grown up. He was now in his early 20s, and he was getting restless. And he had been emperor for nearly 18 years at this point, and he'd never actually exercised genuine power. And so he began trying to push the regent Arbogast aside, and this was dangerous territory for Arbogast, because Arbogast was a barbarian, and he could be very easily charged with some imaginary crime and executed on the orders of Valentinian II. And he understood this. He understood that he could not allow the child, now early 20s, aged emperor, to push him aside, because this was quite legitimately a threat to his life. And so what Arbogast decided is it made more sense for him to revolt and try his luck establishing an imperial regime that would actually protect him than to trust that Valentinian II would actually allow him to continue to live. And so Arbogast then found a rhetorician named Eugenius to be the figurehead of a revolt that Arbogast led. And the revolt proved to be popular among senators in Rome. Eugenius was able to line up significant senatorial support from members of important families. The most prominent is a man named Nicomachus Flavianus. And these senators actively and eagerly supported the revolt against Valentinian II. But ultimately, this revolt again drew Theodosius back into Italy. And in 394, Theodosius invaded. At the end of the campaigning season in 394, Theodosius won a significant victory at the Battle of the River Frigidus. And this victory destroyed a huge part of the Western Roman army and allowed Theodosius to move into Italy as the sole emperor. Of significance. Arcadius and Theodosius' son Honorius both were alive, both had imperial portfolios, but Theodosius was clearly the one who was in charge. And he would remain the supreme emperor ruling over the entire Roman Empire until his death in 395, a premature death. Theodosius was at that point only 48, and he would be the last person to rule over the unified Roman Empire. And so this is the political setting of the 370s, 380s, and mid 390s. But what's really important against this political backdrop is the religious setting. Because this changes dramatically in both the East and the West, in part because of this pivot that Theodosius was forced to make by his inability to defeat the Goths. If you look back from the reign of Julian, Julian, of course, was very aggressive in trying to reverse some of the anti-pagan policies of Constantine and Constantius II. And he's very successful in reversing this. And Valentinian I and Valens have very little interest in these issues. And so they reverse some of the worst parts of Julian's religious policies, especially the teaching edict. But for the most part, they allow the temples to remain open, they allow sacrifices to continue, and they don't have much interest in pushing anti-pagan policies. And this remains true under the first stage of the reign of Gratian. What shifts this is Theodosius' decision to move aggressively against paganism in the early 380s. But because Theodosius does this, and Theodosius changes the conversation about what an emperor should do, Gratian feels compelled to follow. And so Gratian does a number of things that are particularly interesting. He abandons the title of Pontifex Maximus. He removes funding from the imperial cults in the city of Rome. And he also removes the altar of victory from the Senate house in Rome. Now, this is a significant kind of propaganda move. But it's also something that has real significance for the way Romans think about their religion. Rome is the city of Rome is a sort of unique case in the empire because across most of the rest of the empire, traditional religion is a local affair. The imperial government doesn't really have a huge amount of interest in how things are done during the imperial period in the cults across the empire. But the cults in the city of Rome are different. There's an understanding that whereas the empire can allow the functioning of local religion to be funded by local resources everywhere else, the government must fund publicly with public funds the activities of the cults in the city of Rome. This goes all the way back to the idea that the gods in the city of Rome are the fundamental gods who support the empire, and the state must provide those funds to continue to secure the support of those gods. And so when Gratian pulls funding from these cults, this has a real significance in the minds of Roman pagans. Roman pagans meaning pagans in the city of Rome, because he's changed the equation for how paganism should work, and he has directly taken action to undercut the kind of protection that imperial and state funding of religious rights would have and was supposed to have secured. But the altar of victory is in some ways a really significant symbolic step, because the altar of victory had been placed in the Roman Senate House by the Emperor Augustus as a symbol of Augustus's victory in the stabilization of the state following the civil wars that led to the collapse of the Republic. And it had remained in the Senate House, it seems, for the better part of almost 350 years, until the Emperor Constantius visited Rome in the 350s. And the Emperor Constantius then ordered the altar taken out of the Senate House. We're not totally sure why, but it seems that the reasoning was that Christians should not be forced to sit in a space where a sacrifice to a pagan god was taking place. Now, the altar of victory is brought back in the 360s. Most people think that Julian did it. There's no actual evidence that says Julian did it, but this would make the most sense. And then the altar of victory just remained in the Senate House under Valentinian and for a while under Gratian. But as Gratian begins to take these steps in the early 380s to confiscate the resources of Roman paganism and start the process of suppressing traditional religion in the West, the altar of victory is removed as well. Um, Now, Gratian's religious moves are serious, but they are, in a sense, responsive. They are, in a sense, following on moves that Theodosius had taken. And Theodosius's steps have a number of effects across the 380s that are felt more widely and more profoundly than just something like the removal of resources from the cults in the city of Rome. The first steps that Theodosius takes are connected to the religious perspectives and the theological perspectives of the bishops working in Constantinople. And so one of the first things that he does, once he makes this pivot away from being the emperor who's going to defeat the Goths to being the emperor who's going to champion Christianity, is to call a council in Constantinople in 381 that reaffirms the Council of Nicaea and scraps all of the creeds that had been experimented with in the 350s by the Emperor Constantius that tried to find some kind of compromised position between Arians and Catholics. And what Theodosius has done is he has basically taken this Western perspective that Arianism is strange and compromise is not really ideal, and he's kind of doubled down on this. He's now had a council that reaffirms the idea that these compromise positions should not be endorsed. What should be endorsed is Nicaea, Nicaea alone, and he then dispossesses Arian bishops from the churches in Constantinople that they had been occupying under the Emperor Valens. Even more striking, though, is the development of his anti-pagan activities. So this starts with a series of laws that Theodosius issues that, in a sense, restate some restrictions on pagan activities that had begun under the Emperor Constantius II. Things like sacrifices are now illegal, temples are now closed to the kind of worship that had been permitted since the reign of Julian. But as you move deeper into the 380s, what we see is Theodosius becomes much more tolerant of aggressive actions against paganism. And so in 388, Theodosius' associate Symmachus, who was an official in charge of basically most of the provinces in the Eastern Mediterranean, he's the Praetorian prefect of the East, meaning he is the supervisor of the governors of all of the provinces basically stretching around the eastern coast of the Mediterranean from northern Syria all the way down into Egypt. Now, Symmachus, as the Praetorian prefect, has military forces at his disposal, but he also is a figure who has responsibility for touring the area under his ultimate authority and deciding what's going on and how to respond to issues there. But what Symmachus decides to do is to use this tour of his provinces as a way to lead armed attacks against pagan activity in the cities and countrysides of his area. And this is important because the Praetorian prefect of the East is next in the hierarchy to the emperor. He is in essence as high as someone who is not the emperor can go in the administration of the territory. And in the administration of the empire. And so he is a very important official. And what he decides to do during this tour is to travel with military advisors and troops, but also allow groups of monks and clergy to go along with him. And these monks and clergy, as they go along with him, attack temples in the countryside. And this prompts Libanius, who is living in the Syrian capital of Antioch, the place where the Praetorian prefecture is based, to complain about the illegality of these actions. And he says that this kind of rampaging with troops and these kind of mercenary figures almost, these Christian renegades, this is nothing less than war in peacetime, waged against the peasantry. So what is your purpose, he asks the Emperor Theodosius, in maintaining armed forces and equipping your armies and conferring them with commanders if one group of your subjects attacks another and prevents them from sharing in the general prosperity? And the assertion, of course, is that they're punishing those who offer sacrifice and therefore break the law that bans it. But this assertion is always a lie. And so what Libanius is saying is, during the tour that Symmachus is mounting through the eastern provinces, his military troops are not protecting Romans from the attacks of other Romans. In fact, these other Romans, elsewhere in this oration, Libanius calls them a black-robed tribe that eats more than elephants. These other Romans, these monks, are undertaking deliberate violence against pagan communities. And instead of stopping this, or instead of protecting the pagan communities from this kind of attack, Symmachus is standing aside. But because there is an army traveling with Symmachus, it's not really even possible for pagans to respond to this effectively, because they can't attack the monks who are attacking the temples, because those monks, while they are not government officials, and while they are not officially acting on the orders of Theodosius or Symmachus, they are de facto protected by the troops that are traveling with Symmachus. And so instead of the troops maintaining peace in the Roman state, they are actively instead permitting attacks by one group of Romans against other groups of Romans. And this, Libanius says, prevents people from sharing in the general prosperity that Theodosius is supposedly promising. And so what we see is that what Theodosius has done is he's permitted a kind of extra legal set of actions against pagan activity. Does Theodosius know this is happening? Most certainly he knows. Does he explicitly approve of it? No. This is, in a sense, a kind of shadow war against paganism. But by 391 and 392, a series of laws passed or issued by Theodosius represent a real change, because at this point Theodosius explicitly orders that temples are to be closed and people are not to enter them at all. And paganism is criticized in these laws, and any act of sacrifice, including the use of incense, is prohibited. Now, this is a law against practice. It still does not sanction the kind of violent attack against pagans that we're beginning to see kind of hinted at in Libanius' oration. Now, most of what Symmachus and his people are doing is attacking pagan property. They are not attacking pagan people. And Theodosius makes it explicit, even in these laws in 391 and 392, that these laws are about pagan practices and pagan property, not pagan people. And so paganism is criticized, pagan activity is banned, pagan access to temples is stopped, but there is no persecution of pagan people. Theodosius is only prohibiting pagan religious activities, but it's still legal to be a pagan. And so what we see is a significant move in the 380s towards delegitimizing pagan activity and attacking pagan institutions and pagan ways of worship. And these steps, both those of Gratian and especially those of Theodosius, are not universally popular. Pagans are not a majority by the 390s. It seems the empire has tipped at this point to a Christian majority, but it's a bare Christian majority. And so pagans are still a significant group in society, and many of them are wealthy and important. But what they do not have is control over the levers of government. And this brings us to the controversy over the altar of victory. The altar of victory is, of course, a mainly symbolic thing. There are not many people who go into the Senate. There's probably 1,000 senators or so in the West. Most of them never go to a Senate meeting. Most people in the empire, I mean, the empire has perhaps 60 to 70 million people in it at this point. Very, very few people have ever even seen the altar of victory. Thousands at most have ever been in a room when anyone has done anything to worship before the altar of victory. And so the controversy over the altar of victory is on one level basically meaningless. It is not going to change the religious reality for very many people at all. But it's also something that's very symbolically important. Because when the altar of victory is removed from the Roman Senate by the Emperor Gratian, it's carted off basically to some sort of storage area. Its restoration would be the easiest thing to undo out of all of the reforms that Gratian and Theodosius had undertaken. And so, in one way, this is symbolically much more important than it is tangibly important. This is the easiest way to make a gesture to say that the policies restricting and attacking pagan practice need to be amended. And the background to this situation is particularly important because the senators making the appeal in 384 to have the altar of victory restored have leverage. They have leverage in a way that senators really hadn't for the last 10 years, especially pagan senators. Now, the altar of victory is taken out in 381. And in 382, when Gratian is still alive, Symmachus, who is a prominent senator, leads an appeal by the Senate to Gratian to try to restore it. And he actually petitions the emperor, and the emperor doesn't feel any need to listen. And so there's not even an actual response that comes from Gratian. The petition is just denied, kind of without even really being taken seriously. But in 384, the position of the Senate is different. And this is because the revolt of Magnus Maximus and the elevation of Valentinian II as the emperor in Italy, who was leading a regime that was opposed to Magnus Maximus, this changes the dynamic and the position of the Senate. Because Valentinian II is very much a figurehead. He's a person who stands at the top of a coalition that pagan senators represent, in which pagan senators represent a really significant component. And so part of the reason why they feel in 384 they can make this appeal is because they understand that the regime of Valentinian II depends on their support much more so than the regime of Gratian did. But there's another aspect of this. Another person who had made sure that the regime of Valentinian II wasn't immediately overthrown by Magnus Maximus was the Bishop Ambrose. So while the Senate was organizing resources in Italy to arrange for the defense of the peninsula against a possible invasion by Magnus Maximus, Ambrose was sent to go and negotiate with Magnus Maximus and delay his approach to Italy while this defense was being created. And Ambrose does this very well. He goes into Gaul in late 383, and he manages to delay things long enough that the weather changes and the Alpine passes are blocked by winter weather. And then the defense of Italy can be arranged. And so the defense of this regime of Valentinian II relies very heavily on the Senate, but it also relies very heavily on Ambrose. And both of them have a debt of gratitude that they could call in. And so in 384, when Symmachus appeals on behalf of the Senate for the altar of victory to be restored, there is a chance that this could work. And the regime of Valentinian II has to listen. They know they have to listen. But when Ambrose responds to this, he has to be listened to as well. And so this is why the exchange about the altar of victory is so important. What you have in this exchange is a back and forth by two prominent individuals who speak for constituencies that are very important to the regime of Valentinian II. And so both of them speak under conditions where they think there's a chance they will be listened to. but they know there's no guarantee they will be listened to. This is one of the rare moments where an effort to persuade is a legitimate attempt to change opinion because you feel like you might be able to do it. And this is an especially important thing because changing imperial policy about religious activities and religious agendas in the 4th century is very difficult to do. There was not going to be a Christian who could change Julian's mind about how he was going to be running his religious policy. And pagans who tried to change Constantine or Constantius's mind also don't really end up in good positions. Constantine, for example, killed the philosopher Sopater, who came and tried to actually do this sort of thing. And so this altar of victory exchange is a very rare moment. It's a moment where pagans think they have leverage, and they actually do have some leverage. Christian bishops believe that they have leverage, and they really do have leverage. And imperial officials acknowledge the leverage that both of them have, and they listen. And they craft a policy that's supposed to be responsive to both of those sets of ideas. So the appeal that the Senate launches in 384 is put forward by Symmachus. And Symmachus at this point is the prefect of the city of Rome. He is the official in charge of governing the city of Rome. And so his appeal matters because he has the standing to go to the emperor and say, this is a concern I'm expressing on behalf of the Senate and the people in the city of Rome. When Ambrose hears that Symmachus is making this request, he first writes a response, and letter 17 is Ambrose's response. And it's a response that he writes when he learns that Symmachus has made the request, but he doesn't actually know what Symmachus's request says. And so Symmachus's request, Ambrose's 17th letter, this preemptive response to Symmachus's appeal, Symmachus's appeal, which is the third relatio that we read, and then Ambrose's 18th letter, which is the response that Ambrose writes once he's seen the argument that Symmachus makes, are all preserved. And this is really crucial. This is really important because we can see how the debate unfolds. In letter 17, Ambrose frames a basic argument that he expects will be a kind of argument on principles and a sort of general statement of why Christians should not have the altar of victory there. He doesn't know what Symmachus has said. And so this gives you a sense of the kind of general principles that Christians would pursue when they're discussing this. Ambrose's basic argument in letter 17 is that it's sacrilegious for the emperor to force Christian senators to smell fumes from a pagan altar. And this is particularly important because in the past, pagans persecuted Christians. And so because pagans persecuted Christians, why should Christians do favors for pagans who are asking for the right to religious practice, when pagans didn't extend the same to Christians? And then Ambrose says it would be like a persecution again. To have Christian senators attend the Senate with the altar in place. And because this is a religious matter, this is not something that civil authorities should really weigh in on. A Christian emperor should not force Christians to smell the incense set before an altar of victory. They should not force a Christian senator to be in a space where pagans pray to this altar. And this ultimately is not a civil matter. It's not a place for the emperor to intervene. And, Ambrose concludes, your father and your brother would both be upset. Your brother especially, Gratian, the brother of Valentinian II, who had put this in place, who had put this restriction in place. Now this is a kind of generic almost response to pagan claims that they should be treated fairly. You can see in this a set of ideas that obviously Christians have been explaining for the better part of almost half a century. Why, if pagans persecuted us, should we not be entitled to also persecute pagans? Why, if pagans mistreat us and used the law against our practices, why should we be respectful of a law that tolerates their practices? But what Ambrose was shocked to learn is Symmachus makes no argument of the sort. He's not making an argument about toleration. Instead, he's making an argument that removing the altar of victory and pulling support for the state cults is a threat to the state. And this is a very different kind of argument than Ambrose anticipated. But Symmachus's argument is very, very powerful because, in a sense, without saying it explicitly, he's pulling back the veil on the rhetorical success, but the tangible failure of the emperors in the late 370s and early 380s. What Symmachus is saying is these emperors are acting against paganism, and they're doing so at a time when the empire is actually facing crisis. And their actions against paganism is exacerbating the crisis the empire is facing. Now, he's not so explicit as to say that. He's not so explicit as to say Theodosius failed to confront the barbarians, and this crisis is being made worse by his attacks on paganism. But the implication is very clear. And so Symmachus is very careful in how he frames this argument. He says that we must restore the traditional order that benefited the state. And the altar of victory is a key part of this traditional order because the gods bring great benefits to the Roman state. And they have done this for a very long time. And he uses the example of Hannibal as a key point of proof for this. And he says that in the end, the neglect of the old pagan rites bring misfortune, whereas the support for these rites brings fertility, it brings bountifulness, it brings protection. It's what made Rome great. And as we walk away from what made Rome great, we put the state at risk. Now, two passages really stand out in Symmachus's plea. The first one is this: who is so friendly with the barbarians as not to require an altar of victory? We will be careful, therefore, and avoid a show of such things, but at least let the honor be paid to the name, which is refused to the goddess. Your fame, he says to Valentinian, which will last forever, owes much and will owe still more to victory. Let those be averse to this power whom it has never benefited. Do you refuse to desert a patronage which is friendly to your triumphs? That power is wished for by all, and let no one deny what he acknowledges is to be desired and should also be venerated. Now, what Symmachus is saying here is that the peace of the gods, secured by the rights of the city of Rome and the presence of the altar of victory, has served us very, very well. It's 384. The last time Rome was seriously threatened by attack from an outsider was Hannibal, nearly 600 years before. And so why would anyone turn their back on something that has worked so well for so long? And what's key, of course, in this is the line, who is so friendly with the barbarians as not to require an altar of victory? Well, who is so friendly with the barbarians in 384? Theodosius, the Christian emperors, the people who cannot defeat the barbarians and so make agreements with the barbarians, and then, to secure their power, turn their back and begin attacking the very rituals and religious activities that secure the peace of the gods, that had made Rome successful and able to deal with barbarians effectively and capably for all of Roman history up until recently, up until Theodosius, up until the deal that Theodosius makes with the barbarians in 383. And he goes on to say to the Christian emperor something that is quite interesting, and again, very much in keeping with pagan ideas. Symmachus says, look, all we are asking for is peace for the gods of our fathers and our country, the Pax Deorum. It is just that all worship should be considered as one. We all look on the same stars, the sky is common, the same world surrounds us. What difference does it make by what pains each seeks the truth? We cannot attain to so great a secret by one road. But this discussion is rather for persons at ease. We offer now prayers, not conflict. And so what Symmachus is basically saying here is a very pagan perspective on how one worships. Symmachus is saying what pagans have said forever. How you approach the gods is up to you. We're not dictating any particular way that anyone approaches the gods. But we must maintain the peace of the gods. We must maintain this general sense among the gods that Rome venerates them, and therefore they will protect us. And so by stepping into this and saying there is only one way to worship, it is a Christian way to worship, and nothing else should be permitted, this endangers the peace of the gods. It endangers our country. And making this kind of claim is something that will have disastrous consequences. Instead, why can't we just be respectful of how everybody does what they do? And be assured that this will protect Rome because it will keep all of the gods happy, be it a Christian god or be it pagan gods. All of these gods need some sort of appeal. All of these gods need protection. We don't know what the correct way to do this is, and why does it make any difference if we tolerate other approaches? And Symmachus goes on to say, and let me be clear, this is not about the cause of defending only religion. This is about tangible things. For deeds against religion have arisen, because from these deeds against pagan religion have arisen all of the misfortunes of the Roman nation. The law of our ancestors honored the Vestal Virgins and the ministers of the gods with a moderate support, moderate maintenance, moderate financial resources, and special privileges. And this grant of resources and privileges remained unassailed until the time of the degenerate money changers who turned the fund for the support of sacred chastity into hire for common porters. And a general famine followed upon this, and a poor harvest that disappointed the hopes of all the provinces. And this was not the fault of the earth. The year failed through sacrilege, for it was necessary that what was refused to religion should be denied to all. And Symmachus's message here is clear. This is the famine of 384 that Ammianus talked about earlier. When Ammianus talked about the intellectuals being kicked out of the city of Rome because there wasn't enough food, this is what he's talking about. And what Symmachus is saying is that famine that is fresh in everybody's mind, that famine happened not because it didn't rain, but it didn't rain because the gods were denied their just support. And when we refuse to support the gods, they refuse to support us. And so Symmachus is saying this is not just a conceptual discussion about religion and religious tolerance. This is about tangible disasters that are befalling Rome because the support of the gods has been taken away. And if we want those disasters to stop, we must restore the support for the gods. And that starts with restoring the altar of victory to the Senate. And when Ambrose sees this, he realizes this demands a response. Because his initial response was exactly the thing that Symmachus says, it doesn't matter anymore. Let's not have a theoretical argument, Symmachus says, about whether religion is good or bad. Let's instead look at what happens. You took support away from traditional religion, and we can't defeat barbarians, we don't have enough food, and this is only the beginning of the problems. Things will get worse unless you do what the Senate is asking. And the Senate then is framing this as an actual, tangible request for resources to fix problems, real problems, tangible problems. And Ambrose realizes that's actually a really compelling argument. There are really compelling points of data that say that things have gotten worse since we turned away from traditional religion. And so Ambrose now realizes that a theoretical argument about religion has been basically rendered moot by what Symmachus has done here. Symmachus has said there are tangible consequences to this. This isn't a theoretical discussion. This is about the fate of the city and its empire. And so Ambrose has to recalibrate his response. And Ambrose's 18th letter is this recalibration. He says, there are 3 points that are made by Symmachus, and they're all wrong. So he says, for example, Symmachus says that the sacred rites repelled Hannibal from the city walls, but Hannibal was also a pagan. And so why is it that Hannibal could worship pagan gods, Romans worship pagan gods, and we look at one beating the other and say, well, that validates paganism? Now, this is, of course, disingenuous in a way. When Hannibal was attacking Rome, the gods and the rituals that the Romans performed are directly connected to the rituals that Symmachus says wants to come back. He wants to bring back. But Ambrose does realize there is a bit of ambiguity in what Symmachus is saying. If Symmachus says every ritual should be permitted, well, Hannibal did actually worship gods that are still worshipped in the empire. And so, how does that then work? If we're going to say Roman rights bring Rome success, but now that the empire includes spaces where Carthaginian gods are worshipped, how does that work actually? And so Ambrose is here pointing out a kind of incongruity in the argument that Symmachus is making. But Ambrose has more substantial criticisms to make. He says, so Symmachus says that by one road you cannot attain to so great a secret. But Ambrose says Symmachus doesn't understand that we actually know the road that we follow is right, because the voice of God tells us this. And what Symmachus seeks by fancies and by sort of trial and error, we know from God himself is wrong. We know that Christianity is the only way, and this comes from the wisdom and truth of God. And so your ways don't agree with ours. You ask for the Pax Deorum. You ask for the peace of the gods from the emperors. We ask for peace for the emperors themselves from Christ. And so what Ambrose says is that argument is irrelevant when we know the truth. You say you don't know the answer. You don't know what the secret is. We do know. God told us. And therefore, this argument should be set aside. If you're a Christian and you believe that, yes, indeed, God communicated through Jesus what the empire is supposed to be like, then Symmachus's argument is something that you must rule out of bounds. But Ambrose also responds very powerfully to Symmachus's argument that there is a tangible consequence to the breaking away from traditional religion. Ambrose says, look, you point to a public famine that came about because of the breaking of support for the traditional gods. And certainly, many years ago, the lights of the temple were taken away throughout the world, but it's only now that it comes into the minds of the gods to avenge this. Who then is so unused to human matters as to be astonished at the differences of years? And yet even last year we know that many provinces abounded with grain, and so in the former year some did not wither because of sacrilege, and then in the latter year they flourished with the fruits of faith. So what is going on here? If this famine happens because we abandoned the gods, well, in the 350s we also banned sacrifice and nothing happened then. And now when we turn away from the gods, as Symmachus says, well, yes, okay, there's a shortage of food in Rome, but in other places there's more food than normal. And so how then do you get a clear causal connection between abandoning the gods and there not being enough food? So yeah, there wasn't enough food at Rome last year. And yeah, we did turn away from and remove the altar of victory, but how are those things connected really? Because in some places, this is just about rain and randomness and nature. And so we cannot actually establish a causal connection. And so Symmachus's claim that the empire is suffering because we've turned away from the gods, well, it's in a sense a coincidence. This doesn't work as a causal chain. And Ambrose then says, ultimately, he says the rights of our ancestors ought to be retained. But seeing that all things make progress towards things that are better, why is this true? Because the day doesn't shine in the beginning, but as time proceeds. It's bright with the increase of light, and it grows warm with the increase of heat. And this is what we are doing. Ambrose says, Symmachus wants us to go back to the past. But Christians understand that we are actually making progress towards something that's better. And so why should we go back to the past simply because it's the past? When you look at the day, what you realize is the beginning is not the brightest time of the day. The day proceeds. Things get brighter. Things get better. Things get warmer. Progress is natural. And what we have with the embrace of Christianity and the turning away from paganism is progress. And this is a very important point. Christians like Ambrose argue now explicitly that the past is not better than the future. This is a very new thing for Romans. Romans, like Gibbon, like every thing that we've been looking at in this class, Romans struggle very seriously with this idea of decline. They struggle very seriously with the idea that things are getting worse. And if they're getting worse, they need to be returned to a time when things were better. What Ambrose says is it has never been better. We are moving towards what's better. We are progressing. And the past is irrelevant to that because the past is something we are moving beyond. And so when Symmachus says we need to go back to what we did before, he's missing the point because our society is moving towards something that's better. And in the end, in the 380s, one could still believe this. One could still look at this and say, the empire is getting better. Things are getting better. But this is an idea that is going to be very significantly challenged as we move into the 5th century. Symmachus's claims that things are getting worse, not better, begin to look more and more persuasive, especially in the West, as the 4th century gives way to the 5th. But in the 380s, none of that has happened. In the 380s, what Ambrose says about this idea that the state is moving progressively towards something that's better is good enough. And what the court of Valentinian ultimately decides is that they will not restore the altar of victory. They will give Ambrose what he is asking for, but they also understand they need to give something to the Senate. And so the court gives high offices to pagan senators, and it also gives them permission to do some things in the city that improve the conditions of temples and other sorts of centers of pagan sentiment. And so in the end, the court of Valentinian comes up with a compromise that kind of acknowledges the ideas of both sides. They don't want two groups of their most prominent supporters to continue to fight, and so they come up with something that sort of splits the difference between them. But this argument about progress is something that the emperor implicitly accepts. And so this is an argument that will be very meaningful to Christians. But Symmachus's argument about decline is also important to accept because this is now out there. This idea that walking away from the traditional religion has started to cause problems in the 380s will continue to be there as the problems mount in the 5th century. And so this argument foreshadows a much more serious argument that will have much more serious consequences for both pagans and Christians as the relative peace and prosperity of the 380s gives way to the beginnings of crisis in the 5th century.